Good day to you. This is Galactic on the 7th day of January 2026. And over here, you'll see a brief outline, which is adapted from an online source, Geologic Time Classification. Geologic Time Classification, hanging on every classroom wall in the United States of America. At least while I was being raised, there was a diagram of geologic time classification for the brainwashing of the children of the United States. Geologic time classification is an invention of the human mind for the classification of geologic time. Can you name any of the classes in the geologic time classification system? You have undoubtedly heard the term Jurassic, because there's a famous Hollywood science fiction movie, mass broadcast, as a propagandizing technique. Should that be in use, of course, that is completely conspiratorial, wacko, a wacko notion I'm introducing here because it's so familiar. You are perfectly acquainted with psychotic notions that are distributed for your dancing and dining pleasure as such. Let us, the pros, tell you something that is psychotically disturbed so that you have to learn it. You will learn this. Jurassic. What does that mean? Jurassic. Jurassic Park is about the cloning of extinct animals. Jurassic Park is about modern Western science bringing dinosaurs back into existence. That was the nature of the movie called Jurassic Park, which featured velociraptors tearing human beings to shreds. It featured at least one Tyrannosaurus Rex, which is a gigantic flesh-eating lizard that apparently had been rendered extinct. And we're getting to that topic. How were the dinosaurs destroyed? What caused the extinction of the dinosaurs? The dinosaurs. A most interesting race of saurids, lizards, not amphibians, not birds, not mammals, not fish, lizards. Dinosaur means saurid, which means a lizard. A lizard is a member of a family of creatures. And the dinosaurs were of that class, the same class as snakes. Snakes are members of the lizard family. Dinosaurs are also members of the lizard family. They used to predominate on Earth. How do we know that? Fossils. We find their bones. Dinosaur bones. Dinosaur eggs have been recovered archaeologically from the superficial part of the Earth. Dinosaur bones. Dinosaur bones. are all over the earth. And they've been sitting there waiting to be discovered by human archaeologists who dig up the bones. You have to say something about what you find in science. All of these bones have been pieced together because some of the collections of fossilized dinosaur bones are so extensive and so complete that they can be pieced back together. And there are entire skeletons, as I'm sure you're aware, in museums of natural history all over the earth, have fabulous reconstructed skeletal structures of these gigantic creatures. The Brontosaurus was enormous. The creatures of the older world were much larger on the average than animals are today. You have to explain that. Where did the dinosaurs disappear to? Why are there none? Why were they all over the earth? We have no real conception of how many species of dinosaurs there were. What happened to them? There are theories, of course. How far have we gotten in our research? How long have we known about the dinosaurs? Well, that's quite a story. So the topic today that I just want to introduce to you so that you have a rational, logical, efficient way of evaluating the theories of natural history, the history of life on Earth. That is such an important topic. That is absolutely at the top of the list of human questions. The only class of questions in science that are ranked higher than origins are directly related to origins. If we don't know where we're from, if we don't know where the ecology is from, if we don't know how long we've been here, how we developed as humans, how the ecology got here, how come we don't know that? So the geological or geologic time classification is a very recent invention. It's only 200 years old. There was no geologic time classification before the time of certain geologists in England. England, an island off the coast of Europe. England is the source of this science. It's where it originated in the year 1800. Almost exactly. That's 225 years ago. You could either say that's a long time, or you could say, my God, that was just yesterday. It depends on your frame of reference for a time scale. A geologic time classification is a list of words such as Jurassic, which refers to a time period. So this is so easy. It's just a calendar. That's all it is. But instead of the pages of the calendar being days of the week and the month and the year, they're years, but in a geologic time scale. if you're talking about 1 year at a time, that may be a little fine-tuned. It would be like saying the number of seconds that you have to get to the airport instead of saying it in fractions of an hour. That referring to seconds when it's actually you're talking about minutes and hours, you're just using an inefficient scale. So in geologic time classification, you want a larger time unit, perhaps 1,000 years at a time. All right. Now you're not talking about years, you're talking about 1,000-year periods. Well, okay, that gives us a frame of reference for a time classification system, which is a system of words. It's a word system where you invent words. You can also use words that currently exist and extend their meaning. But in the case of the geologic time classification system, the way it was developed in England 200 years ago, based on new research, new discoveries made in bog layers, in various rudimentary, by modern standards, rudimentary archaeological sites, which were explored by British and European geologists who were finding bones. They were finding bones in the soil, bones of animals, which were fairly quickly analyzed to be of animals. These were animal bones and human bones that were locked in various layers just above the impenetrable surface of the earth. It's very hard to dig down too far into the earth in most places. But in bogs and by lakesides and in various disturbed soil layers, all kinds of bones of animals were recovered from the soil. And this was something that had never been done. These bones, if men had run across fossilized bones within the thousands of years of human history, nobody said a fucking word about it. So nobody knew. Science did not know. Mankind at any communal level was unaware of these bones. This was a major discovery, a huge turning point in the history of humanity. Earth-shaking, absolutely foundation-changing discoveries. Bones of extinct animals, animals that no longer are on Earth. When did these animals go extinct? What was the Earth like with these animals on them? And in order to address these brand new issues having to do with these bones, that a geological time classification was set up ad hoc, just right off the cuff, just impromptu, just ad lib, just make up something fast. Make up a classification system so we can talk about segments of time in the geologic past. What would be the time scale? This was guessed at, but it's not in science a pure guess. It's an educated guess. How old are these bones? Were they just put down into the surface of the earth so that they could be discovered later? They're still intact. They haven't dissolved. So it wasn't that long ago, you might say. Well, the men who first explored this and began sharing their knowledge through such scientific institutions as the English had. This information got disseminated quickly. And this was at the time of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin did geological research as well as biological research aboard the Beagle, and he made several trips. In his lifetime, Charles Darwin was riding the wave. He was right on the cusp. He was born at the same time that the geologic time classification system was being invented. And it's an invention. There is nothing, literally, to make a lousy pun, but there's nothing written in stone anywhere that says that the geologic time classification system is anything other than a hunk of shit that is absolutely arbitrary. Not absolutely, though. Scientists never do anything arbitrary. We're always trying to be logical, but when you're guessing at the age of bones, you have to make some dangerous guesses. Very dangerous, because you're trying to set up a system of analysis. And when you do that, the system tends to stick. No matter how jackassed, no matter how ridiculous is the initial framework. The original geologic time classification system was rudimentary, it was ad hoc, it was completely, arbitrarily determined, except for the obvious objective quantity: time. How old are the bones that are being discovered in Europe 200 years ago? Put yourself back in that day. You have all of these thousands upon thousands of bones, skulls, every bone these animals had. They're being found all over Europe and would eventually be discovered all over the world. Every corner of the world. Fossils have been discovered in Antarctica, tropical plants and animals, in a continent that is covered with a sheet of ice today. Ice! There were animals on a continent that today is covered with a sheet of ice. You have to explain that. That is the meat of science. You have new data that directly affects your perception of natural history. The natural history of the earth, that is exactly what science wants to know. That's one of the highest goals, is to find out our origins. Where does man come from? Where does this ecology originate? What made it? Why is it here? These are the questions that science has been asking since man first opened his eyes on Earth. Where am I? What is this? So the geologic time classification system is literally psychotic. It is psychotic. And I'm going to show you just a little bit of what I mean by that. In about 1000 AD, what is now called CE, or the Christian era, there were men who were making rudimentary investigations into geology in terms of natural history. Al-Biruni made the claim around 1000 AD that India was once a sea. Well, that's quite a thing to say. Where there's land called India, Al-Biruni theorized that India had at one time been oceanic, that it was underwater. And that was about 1,000 years ago. Ibn Sina, who is known as Avicenna, also lived at the same time, wrote an encyclopedic work in which he talked about the formation of mountains. This is rather a novel theoretical extrapolation to try to suggest where do mountains come from. And Avicenna talked about the advantages of mountains in the formation of clouds. That is well known. The adiabatic temperature change with a rise in altitude of a body of vapor-bearing air. The water vapor will start to precipitate out of the air as the temperature drops as the air mass passes over a mountain range. And I think you're well aware of this phenomenon, but Avicenna was pointing out that there is a relationship between the production of rain and the altitude of mountains, which is a valid scientific insight, adding that to our store of objective knowledge that now can be used by others who will point and say the reason why there's more rain in the mountains is because the air mass has to go over the mountains, and that, for some reason, causes it to rain. A valid scientific insight. But what Avicenna was suggesting, which is why he's listed in this article, is that he's talking about the origin of rain. Because you would have to simply explain how does it rain on Earth to start getting at the idea of this cycle, this natural cycle, whereby the atmosphere bears water invisibly, but then it will deposit the water if it has to go over a sufficiently high mountain range. All right, not too much to do with natural history, but he's listed because he's making observations on the surface of the Earth, a geological connection with meteorology, that mountains affect the hydrologic cycle. Quite a valuable insight that suggests quite a bit more research, which, as you well know, has been done to an extraordinary degree. Shen Kuo, about the same time, about 1,000 years AD, or CE, I should say, was in China, and he formulated a theory of geomorphology, of sedimentary uplift, soil erosion, the deposition of silt, and marine fossils. This man was one of the first geologists to discover fossils in the Taihang Mountains in China, which would raise some very important questions. How did marine fossils end up in the Taihang Mountains? That will lead to further investigation, which has been done. Now, after the year 1700, things began to pick up in Europe with the rise of the Industrial Revolution. You have the name Nicholas Steno, who may have been the first stratigrapher. That is, a man who systematically studied geology in terms of strata layers. And that was in 1660. And then came Newton, who made what may be the first guess at the age of the Earth based on a scientific test which he suggested. And that is that the Earth is approximately 50,000 years old. That would be laughed to scorn today. Oh, that Newton. Ha! Still had one foot in the dark ages, didn't he? 50,000 years. What a child. What a backwards ass. Be careful. He gave his reason for his guess, which he admitted was a theoretical extrapolation based on the cooling rate of the Earth. Newton had figured out a way to extrapolate the cooling rate of the Earth. You may be interested in looking at that. He left some notes on this. There have been some writings by learned men who will explain to you and me. I've looked into it just a little bit to convince myself that Newton thought he had a good idea. It turns out there is probably a better way to look at it. Perhaps the cooling rate that he came up with is not quite sustainable. But for whatever reason, Newton hazarded a guess at the age of the Earth, that it's about 50,000 years old. Then a man named Whiston wrote a book in 1700, that's 300 years ago, A New Theory of the Earth, which was a rage. I won't talk about that, I'll bet you can guess, but after 1700, we start getting the big idolatry names, the big fat giants. Newton was a giant. We have lots of giants whose names you're not allowed not to know. They're your gods. And that's the exact scientifically correct word for a name such as James Hutton, who is a Scotsman, and William McClure, another Scotsman in America, who started talking about much more advanced theories for the age of the Earth. The age of the Earth. Now you have been brainwashed. You know how old the Earth is because you were brainwashed to say how old the Earth is. You will say, and I know you will, because you're not allowed not to say, it's 4.5 billion years old. That is the age of the Earth. 4.5 billion years old. Well, that's not exactly the same time scale as 50,000 years. So in less than a century, the time scale for Earth went up several decimal orders. And I know you know what that means. On our next page, we have the attack on the Bible. This is an extremely recent development. Only within the past century have we had conclusive proof that there is a concerted effort to destroy the testimony of the Bible, that the Bible is now public enemy number one for a consortium of scientific giants. This is the United States beast producing the giants, about half of whom are Jews. They're Jews. And every last one of them is a false Jew. A Jew who has no right to call himself a Jew, and no one else has any right to call that man a Jew, a ridiculous anachronism of a designator for a type of human being, is Jew. That term should never be used. There is no such thing as a modern Jew. So when I say that half of the cartel that's attacking the Bible is Jewish, I am being racist. And so I am not saying that. What I'm saying is every single one of the men that you could name in a list, Feynman, Einstein, Witt, half of our mathematicians, half of our physicists are false Jews that now are enlisted in an all-out war against religion. It's to destroy the testimony of the Bible, that is no longer allowed. You cannot believe in the Bible. That is the message of science. Is it? It would depend on what you mean by science, wouldn't it? Is the new atheism a valid lobby in consensual science? Are the new atheists who despise religion, hate God, want Jesus crucified again, want Muhammad dragged down off of his camel and pummeled to death in the name of the white children being raised to a new generation? The white Jews, the white Europeans, the white Americans will not allow God. God is dead. That's the meaning of the geologic timescale. It states, and this is the reason for the theory of natural history that is the law of, well, you can't say the law of God, but the law of the giants, the law of the beast, the law that tells you what you're allowed to think is now tightly constrained. There will be no more talk of Jesus. There will be no more talk of a creator. There will be no more talk of religion. That is out. Well, that's like finding out that your baby has cancer of the brain, and the only way to save your baby's life, since it's obvious and logical that the brain being consumed with cancer has to be removed. And so the surgeons take your baby into the operating room and remove the baby's brain. That's geological time. Is to develop an insane model to take the place of anything that might ever be considered rational, be considered rationally, using measurements, making logical deductions of sequences of past experience on Earth. What destroyed the dinosaurs? What buried the dinosaurs? How long ago were those goddamned dinosaurs buried? They're buried! How did those bones get buried so that they did not disintegrate? They did not disintegrate. They were buried alive. They were buried alive. Dinosaurs have been discovered that were in the standing position. You can do your own research. You should. That's what a scientist does. Don't take my word or anybody's word. Check the actual discoveries themselves. That's what a scientist does. Dinosaurs were buried just thousands of years ago. Newton was much closer. There's no such thing as millions of years. There never has been any such thing. The Earth has not been around that long. How do we know that? That's what I'm going to be talking about. The scientific discoveries, the scientific evidence for the age of the Earth. We have to know that if we can. Well, we can now. It's in Wikipedia. Information which was not available to any man when I was in high school is now available, telling us the geochronology of the Earth. It's not millions of years. It does not go back hundreds of thousands of years. Newton was much closer, but he overshot. It is now proved, it's been proved, that the age of the Earth is no more than 10,000 years. Now you have to be cautious when you're saying the age of the Earth. We're talking about the ecology, the life, the living Earth. How long has the Earth been alive? 10,000 years. No more than that. And so everything that you've been taught about Jurassic, Triassic, Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Phanerozoic, all of these terms, there are thousands of these sections of time in a system that is absolutely psychotic. It's ancient. It's over 200 years old, and it has been 100% disproved. That's what's being taught to your children every day. Ranger Rick, a representative of the United States government, is in every classroom telling your children, not teaching them, not giving them choices, not educating them in the slightest degree, brainwashing them with a psychotic geological timescale. This is Enoch, bringing you the secrets of the universe. In the next video, we're going to return to the Quran, where I'm going to give you the origin of religion. Yes, your enemy better not be, because religion is the only answer. We have to consult human records. We'll be right back. Thank you very much.
And I mean that kindly. We're all idiots in the eyes of the universe.